Fantastic. So we now turn from Europe to Africa. The Russian Wagner Group has for several years used information manipulation as a way of gaining influence in the African countries where it has operated, but it is not alone. And the information battlefield is evolving fast, as we heard from Johnny in the first discussion. And we will hear from our speakers about it. Justin Ehrenstein, Chief Executive of Code for Africa, the African Network for Investigative Journalism. Dr. Joana Dedez Pereira, who is Senior Research Fellow at RISI Europe, and Tom Southern, who is Director of Special Projects at the Centre for Information Resilience in the UK. So, Justin, we'll start with you. You are working across 26 countries in Africa, and you are seeing FIMI in every single one of them. Briefly, what are you seeing, and what is the effect, and what are some of the common themes?
So what we're seeing is covert, coordinated misrepresentation. The messaging, though, is invariably these are authentic kind of grievances and kind of zeitgeist that resonate with ordinary African people. And so it's not disinformation. It's rather the coordination and amplification of existing grievances. And we've heard various speakers this morning talking about, kind of why that's important, that the adversaries have evolved beyond just kind of falsehood. They're basically weaponizing the truth. The effect of that, I think, is fairly obvious. We've seen the way that African societies have responded, for example, to the conflict in Ukraine, where there's a disaffection with the suggestion that they should care as deeply about it as people in the minority will do, and that there's rather a big emphasis on the fact that we have our own problems that we need to care about more deeply. Particularly, some of the narratives that we see are very similar to the narratives you actually see around the Ukrainian situation. But you see a very strong push on pan-regionalism, in our case, pan-Africanism. You see a very strong push around kind of an opposition to a perceived neo-colonialism. And the French take the heat of it invariably in kind of the Sahel and Northern Africa. But these are kind of the symptoms. And so what we think people are getting wrong about the problem is that we're not looking deeply enough at the root causes. We're almost playing into the kind of the game that a Russia or kind of, and there are multiple kind of threat actors that they want. And the reason for that is that the knee-jerk response is that we need to do better counter-messaging. And all that does is create more noise and static. It deepens the polarization. It creates actually more distrust in any information. And so we start seeing a lot of news avoidance, and we start seeing a lot of people stepping back from authoritative sources. They're very astute at finding these wedge issues. And again, to stress, these wedge issues are not incorrect. They genuinely reflect lived experiences. It's narrative capture, effectively. And so it's classic, and it's not new. This is classic kind of talk Russian kind of strategy. It's, theory of reflexive control that we saw during the Soviet kind of era. So the inoculation that we are trying to do is just ineffective because it's often done really badly. Secondly, it just doesn't scale because it's too expensive, and it's an ongoing issue. The second point I want to make is that rather than focusing on that, and I mean, we're Africa's biggest fact-checking organization, we do a load of investigative reporting, we invest into media, so we believe it is important, but that's where all the effort is going at the moment. We need to also be taking a step back and treating this problem for what it is. It's covert, it's misrepresentation. That's the classic definition of fraud. And so our push is saying that rather than treating this as a literacy issue, as a problem, as an information problem, we should be treating it as organized crime, which means that we need to be looking at the infrastructure, the monetization, and the kind of the franchising or the subcontracting out of key pieces of the operation. And Russia's very astute at this. The reason why they're able to operate at the scale that they do is that they subcontract out. It's not people sitting in St. Petersburg. It's kind of true believers in some cases, what the Russians call useful idiots, but more often than not, it's information entrepreneurs who are taking up the cause. So we need to be looking at it as an economy, an influence economy, not necessarily a disinformation economy. Then the third point I want to make is that we need to, and it's picking up on the point that someone made earlier about a systems approach, an actor-agnostic systems approach. We need to go beyond that. We need to focus on the infrastructure. The reason that people are able to operate at the scale they do is because it's increasingly, incredibly cheap to do so. Russia and the private military companies are not spending major amounts of money. By orders of magnitude, our attempts to counter them, we're spending way more money to way less effect because we are focusing on the symptom. If we look at disrupting the infrastructure, we're going to drive up their costs. And so we need to focus on the people and the corporations, and I say deliberately corporations because it's not all organized crime. We're talking about political consultancies here in the UK. It would be like a Bell Pottinger, but many of the new Bell Pottingers are based out of Israel. They're political consultancies. We need to be looking at the digital infrastructure, and here we need to be speaking not just to the platforms, but to software vendors, for example, that are being used to produce the material. But also increasingly, there's offline mobilization. There's an entire network of social movements and fake NGOs that have been set up across Africa to mobilize people onto the streets. And we need to be kind of focusing on them, figuring them out, mapping them, and then figuring out how to disrupt them in a way that doesn't close down civic space or freedom of expression. And in the fourth point, the final one I want to make is that it's this thing about driving up the costs. It needs to be a big part of any kind of counter strategy. So we need to be looking at things like made-for-advertising websites. This is people who are milking programmatic advertising, earning, in the case of South Africa, where we've mapped it, 40% of advertising placed, programmatic advertising placed in the country, goes to these fake sites that aggregate the most polarizing, kind of like salacious content possible, because it feeds a clickbait kind of economy. And they're creating effectively the audiences that FIMI operators then tap into. Secondly, we need to tackle the surveillance for hire industry. These are the folk like the Israelis who are able to collect the information that can be weaponized against the watchdogs. And then the software vendors, as I mentioned, these are the people whose goods are being used to create low-cost weaponized content. And there are ways for doing this. We don't need new laws that kind of undermine media freedom. And then finally, the Fediverse is becoming a major staging point for all of these actors. As the platforms get better at kind of deplatforming them, they're creating their own platforms on Matrix and Chirpwire and elsewhere. And we're blind to them because there are no tools and because it's very kind of manual. 2 words of caution. Disinfo isn't constrained by national borders. It flows across borders. And many of the countermeasures we see are designed specifically to shore up support in the Ivory Coast, for example, which is effectively going to become the West Saigon in West Africa after having lost, kind of the rest of the Sahel. And so we need to be thinking transnational. And then secondly, we need to be speaking subnational, because the reality is, and the second caution is, that FIMI is way better than disinfo as a classification, but in itself it is flawed. It was created by Europeans who are not mandated to look internally, and so it's an external thing. The reality is that FIMI builds on EMI. It builds on local infrastructure and local vendors, the Kemi Sebas and the kind of the Africa initiatives of the world. These are all Africans who have built the infrastructure to not just deliver for Russia, but for multiple other threat actors. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. Joanna, can you give us a deep dive on specifics around some of the methodology that the Russians are using to gain influence in Africa?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation and for Justin to pave the ground to what I also wanted to say. So we have grievances that have not been addressed. We don't understand the root causes. However, I think there is one other big question that pops constantly in my mind. Why now? So feelings of anti-colonialism, they were always there, but why now? Why are they having this echo precisely now? And this links to something that I have recognized, identified in endless speeches that I have analyzed. And the truth is, we, the Western people, we suffer from a kind of apathy. We were in a state of apathy regarding former colonies for several decades. We were also on a state of apathy regarding the first invasion of Ukraine. And this apathy state was actually a test. And going back to what Justin was mentioning, that neither of this is new, nor disinformation in the African space is new. It happened immediately after the colonial period. But we cannot forget that this is also a long run for Russia. And by long run, I mean a huge investment in education, for example. Let's not forget that the current elite that Russia supports today studied in Russia. Let's not forget that Russia is massively supporting, for example, scholarships for several thousands of students in Africa. And then there is the how. So I started to look at undesirable foreign influence, as we called it, linked to undesirable foreign funding. That is something that started at DG Home for Radicalization Awareness Policy Network to look at funding coming from third countries that was not illegal, but stand there just between something that you cannot properly define, that is a gray zone that serves multiple purposes. What we came to understand was that the funding always comes and goes hand in hand with the influence. And the same was happening exactly in Africa. And you have here three big axes. So the people, they identified in the people dimension how to weaponize memory first. And the weaponization of memory is a very, very powerful tool, but it's weaponizing actually the truth, not the lie. Then we, the people, you also have a huge opportunity to weaponize one of the greatest fears, especially for European Union, migration, the weaponization of migration. And then you have also an opportunistic sales point, which is looking at African societies, African conservatism, which exist, African values that the people from the West have disregarded or have not really considered. And then you also have to look at the role of diasporas. Justin mentioned Kemi Seba. I will ask you how many of you in this room know that last year he did a tour on Eventbrite on every single big capital of Europe to speak about how the new Pan-Africanist movement, which is based on good things and good ideas, has been manipulated, instrumentalized, and also used as a vehicle to some of the coups that happened last year in the Sahel. Just before entering, and because I follow him on Twitter, he was just appealing to the French Antilles population to revolt. And finally, also to point out on the question of the crime, there was a unique trend that we have also been identifying over the last 3 years, that is the funding and the influence is usually activated on demand. So the nexus is not always there on a constant manner, but it serves a purpose. And this purpose is only just one, is to shake, to fragment, and to weaken. And it's shake, fragment, and weaken. And this has been, as I said, a long run. This has not been immediate. This has not been a strategy over the last 10 years. This has decades. And this is, and ever was, just in front of us. In front of us that, for example, denied African agency. It was in front of us that cannot see what is actually so simple. It's destabilize, to break, and to keep apart, because in Africa lies the future of food security, energy security, and some of the answers for climate change action. And I'll stop here.
Fantastic, really interesting. Tom, can you tell us a little bit about the wider cultural tools that are being deployed? And from your experience, what are some of the policy tools you believe should be used by Europe and the West to counter these narratives?
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm going to echo almost everything you guys say, so I'm going to try and go in a slightly different direction. I think one of the slight problems that we have with FIMI, it's a massive problem, across all societies, is that predominantly people don't believe that they are being targeted, and if they do believe they're being targeted, they think that they're more resilient than they actually are. That's true in Africa, that's true in Europe, that's true in absolutely everywhere. One of the reasons that I try and do the work that I do is to try and build that understanding in sort of these societies, and that, a lot of it comes down to networks. Fundamentally, it's human networks. And the reason to do that is the way that Russia is operating in Africa is so outrageous once you get into the weeds of it, that actually it should be relatively easy to put this in front of people and for them to go, that's terrible and outrageous. But because FIMI is an emergent property of complex systems going back decades, millennia, whatever, we can't do that at the moment. So a few examples of some of the more outrageous things that they've been doing. I mean, Justin, you mentioned obviously some of the front NGOs that they put forward, which are nominally there to support youth or women or whatever it might be, and then they just spin on a dime and try and sort of cause some kind of chaos. There's some super weird ones, and I would embrace the super weird because that's how he gets people attention. So the Russian Orthodox Church has started an exarchate in Africa because of the schism with Ukraine. They felt that they could sort of take over what was Alexandria's patch. And every time I talk to people about this, people go a bit glassy-eyed and they don't really understand why we should care about this. Well, they've recruited over 50 priests in Kenya in rural areas. Kenya is a democracy. If they can be pumping in their sort of disinformation through their sermons, which they are, by the way, translating into Swahili and other languages, then who knows what they're going to do next. And that's something, because they're going to play the long game, that they're going to do over time. And it's not just the Russian Orthodox Church, it's also them co-opting Protestant churches, it's them coordinating with the like World Congress of Families, of course, which they essentially own in Africa, to co-opt African conservatism, which is, to policy point, right? How we talk about and to Africa is inherently problematic and always has been. And that's why there's so much pushback, right? I get asked quite a lot by people, when we're talking about this kind of thing, this co-option of African conservatism, the co-option of their people, the literal theft, in their case, of some of their people. They're being co-opted into the Russian army. They're being co-opted into drone factories to attack Ukraine. Why can't we say that it's neo-colonialism? Or imperialism? And because those two things have specific connotations, that means the West. We will have to come up with a different term. Exploitation, to me, seems like a sufficient one, because it's exactly what it is. And I think that's probably the point I would come to in terms of policy. I guess the way I look at it is what can people fund and support to help this, right? I think it was actually mentioned earlier by one of the senior panelists from the EU side that funding is always a problem. It's not always been allocated in the right way. We're still doing things that don't work, and it's still attracting quite a lot of funding. And I think we'll probably talk about that a little bit later. We need to repivot that, but we also need to sort of step back and accept that we don't actually know on a psychological level, on a neuro-linguistic level, on any of these levels, why FIMI works. And that's because it's different in every time and place. Any issue, it's a different approach. Any person could be susceptible to one thing, but not another. So we don't know. We don't have the scientific backing behind it. And we haven't got sufficient networks in the countries that we operate in. And so in Africa, I work with a huge number of people, but my main goal of that is not to just bring in think tanks and journalists, though they are extremely important. It's to help situate the problem of FIMI in wider society. So we need to bring in the business people who understand the finances of the country and why they might be affected, and then they have a constituency to speak to, but also they will have solutions to build. We need to bring in, I mean, dare I say it, gamers and other young people. I mean, Russia's just released a game in Burkina Faso called African Dawn. I mean, nobody's going to play it in Burkina Faso, really, but the point is that they're doing it. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should build games like Call of Duty, which I guess you could argue are just US propaganda, but we need to be able to understand how these sort of things operate in these countries and what we might do to support, not impose, support people in these African countries to actually build this kind of stuff up. Because one thing that I always slightly worry about with networks is they're often seen as a tool, and they're not a tool. These are people that actually believe in a cause, and you need to support them doing that cause. You shouldn't go there and tell them what to say or think or do. You should only go there to enable them and say, look, we do have some expertise on Russia, so here's the playbook. They're doing it all over again. Here's RT popping up in Kenya. You know, it's all the same kind of stuff. But then they can say, well, this is what we need, and we give it to them. And we don't question why we're giving it to them, other than they are the good people and they need to do it. And that's sort of, I think, where I'll stop is, yeah.
Fantastic. I will pick up in a minute with both of you the relationship between Russia and China, but I want to start with you, Justin. Talk a little bit about jihadists. How do they fit into the picture? We haven't talked about them.
So we've seen, firstly, consolidation amongst kind of the splinter jihadist organizations across the Sahel and the Maghreb, and increasing coordination. They've adopted Web3 and Fediverse far quicker than everyone else. Very, very astute at using it for staging, grooming, recruitment, and then kind of boiling out onto open social. And when Meta kind of joins Threads, the rest of the Fediverse, we're expecting to see that as a backdoor back into the platforms. We saw in the early days Wagner amplifying jihadist messaging to create a need or a concern for their security services in places like CAR and elsewhere. We've seen since the fragmentation and of kind of Wagner, we've seen massive battlefield defeats of Russian private military across the Sahel that only really get airplay on kind of dark social. And I think that the point I'm trying to make is that they don't always, well, they seldom lie. It's the regime, the junta, that lies. They're simply live streaming from successful kind of, or victories on battlefields, including against Wagner, but also against normal kind of national troops. They use humor. And I think that Russians, they learned this from the Russians. So to your point about kind of, you know, the West and FIMI responses are always very earnest. The Russians take the mickey out of it. They produce like satire, they produce kind of anime type kind of cartoons that go viral, tens of millions of views across the continent. They portray themselves as the avenging angels coming down to defeat the French zombies and the kind of the jihadist kind of monsters, cannibals. And so we see a lot of interplay between those two. They almost need each other. There's a third factor, though. It's not just the jihadists, because the jihadists almost have assumed the power of the self-defense kind of team. So this is the secessionists of people who are trying to defend their communities against predatory states. And instead, what we see the West doing is coming in and strengthening those states. And so it drives people first to these self-defense units, and then often into the arms of a jihadist kind of alliance. To your point about religion, it's not just in Kenya. We've literally tracked the names of about 4,000 Africans who are being trained at the moment in Russia as either nuns or priests, Orthodox. But also in Sudan, we see Russia right across the border from Ethiopia, where there's a very strong focus on the Orthodox Church. We see Russia positioning itself as a defender of the faith, pointing to their record in Syria against ISIS. And so again, that link back to extremism and to the jihadists as we the only thing that stands between you and extreme religion or the decadence of the West, because they're coming for your kids and they're going to make them gay. So it's these two messages, these two extremes that are being used and weaponized.
Thank you. Turning to Joanna and Tom, can you tell us a little bit about the relationship between China and Russia in this space? Joanna.
So it's kind of, and using my husband's, who's a biologist, words, it's kind of a commensalist relationship where both feed into each other. Obviously, they do not compete, but they allow the other to express their wishes and their projects and their motivations. Why is this problematic? China, as you all know, has been growing extremely fast in Africa, especially buying media platforms, also allowing the population that didn't have access to media and TV to have it at a very cheap price. And at the same time has been allowing Russia to spread their message, basically in terms of the language that they are using. For example, what in the Bucha massacre was mentioned there this morning when it was broadcasted in a Chinese platform. It was broadcasted as a special operation. But it's more than that. And I think it's also important to also add to the religious aspect, the aspect of language, which is also linked to the aspect of education that I mentioned. In 2023, there were 3 high schools in Moscow, for example, teaching Swahili and Amharic just to reach more easily the future professions that the Russians think that they will have in Africa. Quoting even one of the directors of one of these schools about the motive to offer this 2 languages as a second language, she said that language is a key to the African heart, which again reinforces this idea that I've mentioned before of a long run. This brings huge problems, even and obviously we are under a European Union event in terms of sanctions, for example. Russia has been using the Chinese media platforms in Africa to circumvent the sanctions, for example, posed to RT. And so there is this relationship where one allows and the other gives. That has been quite essential to allow Chinese and Russian interest to strive in Africa. This is also relevant because on the Chinese side, you have also a huge investment in what regards language. So they have been buying small newspapers, small radios. There are cases already in Nigeria where you have broadcasting in Hausa language. So we are no longer talking about it's either French or English. No, there is a huge investment in the local language. To what? To reach the heart. And this may seem kind of a detail, but this war and FIMI is also profoundly rooted on an emotional dance that we probably have not understood the rhythm yet.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, when we first met, we violently agreed on this. The language issue is really important because Russia and China are investing, but it's a weak spot for them, and it's one that we really should think about exploiting. 1/3 of the world's languages are spoken in Africa. So whilst they might be getting good at the first top 2, 3, 4 languages in any one country, we need to be investing very heavily, sure, in those, but also in the next 5, 10,000. And that's where you get ahead of it. Again, you know, we're coming back to sort of, you know, linguistic theory and cognitive psychology and all of this, but it is also a fact, and we know this, that the first time you see a piece of information about a subject, you are giving more weight than you give the second. So if you get that piece of information about the war in Ukraine, for example, in your local language, and it's a factual one that we've been able to fact check and verify, then even if Russia comes at you next, you're much less likely to give Russia's one weight. So as a relatively inexpensive thing to do would be to invest very significant, well, I say inexpensive and then saying very significant at the same time, but relative is to invest in that kind of thing. And that would also protect against China. China is not as good as languages as Russia is, but it's getting there, and it will be. I think China has a different issue, obviously, with its propaganda in general, that people seem to be able to spot it better. But in any case, they are investing in local networks as well, who will be able to tell them how to contextualize their content. And so we need to get there first.
And what about things like the BBC World Service and all the other, is that a good investment or not for?
I'm a huge fan of the BBC World Service. I don't think it reaches the audiences that we necessarily need it to. I think there's historically been a very heavy focus on Western programming this comes back to language as well, in reaching sort of political and policy elites who predominantly will speak the majority language or potentially will also speak English. And so the assumption is that that would lead to some benefit. But many countries are democracies. Those that aren't democracies still have a population that might want to be a democracy at some point. And actually, it comes back to hearts and minds and understanding. The BBC, whilst an excellent tool, is London-based. It does obviously have its own local stringers and everything, but it is then also associated with the West. And this is part of the problem as well, is that Russia, through RT in particular, actually, was very conscious that the BBC, as a well-trusted media outlet that does proper journalism and fact-checking and everything else, is a problem for them because they're telling the truth. So they spent a very long time discrediting the BBC, and very, very successfully. And now they're doing that through other sort of agencies as well. And so the BBC, sure, can be part of it. I think this is another point that I don't know where it's right to make it, but I've run stories with the BBC before, with The Guardian before, with the New York Times before. The problem is they all want an exclusive. So if you've got this really important story that needs to get out to a Hausa-speaking population, for example, but you also want the international lens, and then the BBC or The Guardian or whoever says, no, it has to be an exclusive, it completely takes the point out of the whole thing. So for any journalist in the room, or anybody working with journalism in the room, can we be a little bit less precious and make sure that everybody gets the credit if we want it, but actually it's about the strategic effect. We're
about to open it up for everyone else, but first of all, I just want to nail one final thing. Motivations. Africa is a big and massively diverse continent. There are different themes going on in different places, and there are different motivations in different places. Maybe, Justin, you can pick up. Can you draw some sort of strands about different motivations and different places that we should look at different patterns?
I don't know about motivations. I think the sense of a continuing injustice cuts across almost all the countries we work in. But we do see maybe 5 or 6 meta-narratives that Russia specifically pushes, and some of those overlap with People's Republic of China narratives. So there are sometimes kind of coincidences that work for those parties. In the same way that Star Times, as a satellite kind of broadcast network that China uses, is now the platform for RT and everything else. But I think that what we need to do is look beyond that, just to your point, Sam, about counter media. We need to look outside of Europe and basically out of the minority world. And the suggestion I'm going to make is not like kind of a majority world suggestion, but Al Jazeera has massive credibility in Africa. I would say even more so than BBC in many places, because it's not Western, it's not democratic, and the rest of it. And I think increasingly in places that speak Arabic, Al Jazeera Arabi, there's an understanding about kind of some of the ideological kind of background to that as well. But TRT is gaining a lot of ground out of Turkey. That's their kind of version of a foreign broadcaster. We need to be looking at these alternative media and figuring out how to support African voices on those platforms. We can't be parachuting in. Yeah.
So that point about motivations and particular ways to look at different parts of Africa.
Yes, but I just wanted to jump on that point, sorry, as well, because there's another sort of factor in that, which is there are countries which speak the same languages, usually post-colonial countries. So I'm thinking sort of like Brazil versus Angola kind of situation, where actually, so in Angola, the most watched TV station is a Brazilian one. And so, where if we can actually go into Brazil, speak to Globo or whoever it is, and get African voices there, then that will reflect back into, one hopes, those countries, which also speaks to a different point that Russia uses those same networks. So they will use a Portuguese-speaking outlet based in, who knows, Porto or, you know, Mozambique or wherever, to feed into those as well. Sorry, question.
No, the question was, how can we think about, rather than see it as one continent, what are the kind of different pockets that we should, or different ways in which we should think about different parts of the continent?
Yeah, this comes back to sort of building the networks, you know, in each country, but not, you know, we need to talk regionally within countries as well. We need to sometimes talk cross-tribally, linguistically. These are all different sort of factors that feature in some cases class factors in quite significantly as well, depending on where you are. And so it's a matter of building that context locally, and it's not easy, it's not quick, and it's not cheap, but it's about actually getting into these communities and honestly asking them honest questions and going there and telling them why you're there. Because if you just come in and you talk about FIMI, it sounds like you're a spy. People aren't going to respond very well to that. You know, Russia has fantastic anthropological departments that go into any country that's about to interfere in. Moldova quite recently, I mean, they've got good track there anyway, and they build a profile of who the people are and what the grievances are, right? So we need to do the same thing. I don't think we need to, it would take, you know, too much to go to you guys and say, well, you already know this, can you just tell us? And we don't need to reinvent the wheel. But then what we need to do is respond honestly and you know, accept that some of the grievances are caused by historical facts that the West did and not try and push that away. You know, we can't.
Including, for example, Ukraine cannot be discussed in Africa without discussing Ethiopia, Tigray, Sudan, or any of the other kind of ongoing conflicts, or even Gaza.
Big one that's featuring at the moment, yeah, absolutely.
I would also probably add here the education dimension. I think this would be something quite easy to tackle under networks, exchanges between students as well. And obviously to say a cliche, but this is true, African problems, African solutions, and to have a better understanding. I have spent the last 3 years training European delegations across the world, most of them in Africa. And what I see more and more and more is that what we think we understand and what we think we know, we are very, very distant from the reality. So this would also pass for a better mapping of organizations on the ground that are doing a good job in relation to disinformation. For example, the work of organizations such as Fondation Hirondelle, which basically tackle and fight disinformation across several countries in Africa. Reporters Without Borders. Not to forget that when we talk about disinformation, we are also talking about media, and journalists in Africa are very, very, very ill paid. So this is another factor that allows Russia penetration on this domain. And finally, to say, because last week the European Union approved a new framework for sanctions that also includes FIMI, and we know that usually policy is triggered by events. However, it is very important, this is probably one of the most impactful packages in terms of recognizing the threats that we do not see. There is a huge layer of a blurred zone of threats that are still yet to be tackled. And I think that this package was actually one of the best amongst the first initial ones that were emitted by the European Union. So, yeah.
Thank you. Lots to pick up there. We'll take some questions from our audience, please. This gentleman over there, could you tell us who you are? And we'll take a couple of questions at a time.
Thank you very much. My name is Josh. Just a quick question following up on the points you made towards the beginning and the end. So, Justin, you mentioned not parachuting in and the importance of some language and culture and religion. So if it's more trying to counter nefarious intent of countries like Russia and China in Africa, I gather from what you're saying it's better to go bottom up rather than top down. And if it is bottom up, then, and there's not much of an appetite, you mentioned imperialism and colonialism, but should countries like the UK and other Western countries be trying to sort of fight fire with fire and no, it's like, no, there's nothing to counter what Russia and China are doing in regards to religion, and sort of, you mentioned nuns and priests, for example. If you don't take that approach and it is bottom up and these sort of core commonalities are language, religion, culture, then how do you expect to counter it if it is bottom up and we're not going to take a bottom up approach, is my question.
Before we answer, lady here.
Hi, hello. My name is Gabriela Gigaboy. I'm a social psychologist studying trust at Swansea University. I have two questions. One of them is for Tom. You said that we don't know psychologically why FIMI works, and we do. Actually, we do a whole lot now. And actually, Justin said at the beginning that these things work a lot because they weaponize existing grievances. They weaponize existing group dynamics. And we know a lot about group dynamics in psychology. And you've got an army of social psychologists in the UK alone if you want to spread across the border. So please work with them, because a lot of these things work because they create a sense of cohesion and identity, and they respond to people's needs. And of course, they will believe a priest, whatever he tells them, if they go to church and church gives them a sense of belonging. Okay, so we do know a lot from social psychology that could help. So my first question is, please work with social psychologists more. The second one is, I actually wanted to ask this from the very beginning, the very first session. How do you guys communicate about successes? Because it's easy in a world like this today to think we can't believe anything anymore, we can't trust anything anymore. But since this morning, a lot of you said there were attempts to disrupt elections, they didn't work. There were attempts to disrupt Olympics, they didn't work. Well, who knows about those? I didn't. I imagine you can't communicate about everything for security reasons, but the public has no idea that we are still pretty good at rejecting these things. I've done a piece of research on, a very short one, on what people do when they're faced with a video, a drone attack filmed by somebody. And they actually take a very journalistic approach themselves. They try to verify it, they try to corroborate the source. A lot of people still have this natural instinct of trying to figure out if it's real or not. And I have the feeling that a lot of campaigns against FIMI, they don't take that resource into account. And it's a shame because it's there. It's not that everybody doesn't believe in anything anymore. I still think a lot of people are skeptical and they want to, but they have to have some help.
Thank you. A lot in that. Justin, will you pick up both those points? Fighting fire with fire, and how do you communicate success?
So just the point about fighting with fire is that we're doing exactly what they want us to do. They want an argument to happen because that leads to polarization. And it keeps people's attention and resources focused on the narratives rather than, kind of the infrastructure that they've put in place to fight it. So in the same way that there's an economy, a FIMI economy or a surveillance economy, a dark economy, we need to be investing into an integrity economy. We need to be empowering people who are putting really credible, grassroots, bottom-up information in place. For example, we need to be empowering indigenous language Wikipedia, because Wikipedia is what fuels every single Google search. It's the first search return. And if you have a look at the indigenous language content on there, the English is pretty cool. It's peer-reviewed. It's like massively peer-reviewed by kind of other editors. There'll be 2 or 3 authors in any of these underserviced kind of languages, many of whom believe in the craziest conspiracies. And so we need to start strengthening that information infrastructure so that kind of there's a firmer foundation for people to be making kind of evidence-based decisions. People aren't stupid. And in fact, those who are offline are more vulnerable to online misinformation because it trickles down to them and they've got no way of verifying it. So we need to be strengthening that. The second point is journalists are earning like kind of a couple of $100 a month. They cannot live on it. And the same for other people in the space. So we need to be fixing, not through handouts. Please, God, stop the training. Too much money wasted on training. We need to rather be fixing the revenue side of the problem to create a sustainable kind of economy that develops its own kind of resilience against these corrosive factors. At the moment, you make more money out of a kind of a corrosive FIMI kind of activity than you do out of producing good content. We need to swing that kind of, that ratio, the incentives, if you will. People are not stupid. They want information that they can use to get ahead in their lives. And if we start giving them that information, you start building trust again. So I think it's a cliched answer, but it's true because it works here, and so it should work in other places. In terms of the question, sorry, what is the second question?
How do you communicate success?
I think we do. I think it depends what we consider to be success. So the takedowns are communicated quite broadly in Africa when there's an entire takedown of the puppet masters. If you have a look at what's happening in Kenya at the moment with the kind of the Gen Z protests against government, there are massive successes there are being communicated out by non-traditional kind of communication champions. And so people are understanding when they have power and they have leverage. I think what we're not doing is joining those dots across national borders or between language groups. And so we need to be better at kind of extracting what worked practically somewhere rather than the kind of the emotive human story, but the mechanics of what worked. And then almost as a playbook, kind of sharing that into other communities. Almost there's a thing called solutions journalism, almost taking a solutions journalism kind of approach to building information integrity. And we're not doing enough of that. So I'd say that's where we should be putting more investment in. And it's not all media. I'm a recovering journalist. It's very ineffective in Africa. That kind of era has come and gone. We need to be figuring out where are these other information sources that people rely on. My kid who's 12 or 13 is already telling me TikTok is for old people. So we need to be on Discord. We need to be on Twitch. We need to be figuring out what the new interface is. There's something that she uses called AI Jesus. She's not religious at all. It tells her where to download all the kind of the apps and the fixes for Minecraft. We need to be figuring out what those new conversational interfaces are that people are using to get information, and then injecting this credible kind of info in there to fill the vacuum.
Fascinating.
So, thank you very much for that question. It's as though you read my notes, because I actually have a call to action in here that I wasn't sure I was going to put out. But sorry, the we that I used there is the operative word. So the we that I meant is the people that are doing the implementation of interventions against FIMI. So oftentimes their background, I'm not a scientist myself, I just dabble in Wikipedia. Oftentimes their background is, law or, international studies or security policy, that kind of thing. An alarming number are marketers who have realized that there's some money to be made, and often they are snake oil salesmen, so beware. But those who mean well don't have the scientific background to do it. The second problem, academia lives in a vacuum of academia. And so there's nobody telling me, I could read the journals, obviously, but I've got a kid and I'm tired. So nobody's telling me what the newest scientific hypothesis is in social psychology or neuroscience or neurolinguistics or anthropology, let's go soft sciences, and sociology. Nobody's telling me that. So I don't have time to build it into my programs, unfortunately. I think they should be built in. But the only way that's going to happen, where are the donors in the room? The only way that's going to happen is if the donors provide a fund that allows for that, and it would need to be pretty open-ended. It would be something along the lines of, find somebody who has a social psychology theory and background on a particular strand of AI. I, as the implementer, have the reach to do it en masse. I will give the data that we find back to the social psychologist, who can then pull that back into the science community and up into government. Therefore, we would have an intervention that either worked based on science or didn't work, which is also science. So that's useful, a null result is an end result. And I'm saying all of this in part because it doesn't currently exist and because I want it to, but it's kind of what Russia does. They are very, very willing to test and fail. And unfortunately, because of the frameworks that we operate in, you asked on how do we measure success, oftentimes it's through non-perfect methods, but there is also oftentimes a pressure to produce positive results. And that's a problem. in and of itself. Whereas Russia will just throw something at a wall, and if it doesn't stick, it will pick up and do something else. If a bit sticks, he'll follow it further, and so on and so on. And that's as true in Africa as it is, frankly, anywhere else. And the same problem that applies to Africa in terms of it not being scientifically driven applies in Europe. You know, it's not like we've solved the problem over here, and we can't really be going over to Africa and say, here's the solution. So yes, very grateful. If any donor wants to then pick this up with us, apparently afterwards, and we'll set up this program, then I'm all for it.
Joanna.
Well, I think both Justin and Tom have said everything, but regarding the successes, I think it's always much more exciting, unfortunately for everyone, to know the martyr. It's always more exciting to know the bad than the new, unfortunately. But this point of building and investing on integrity, it's kind of, I think, the biggest objective. And this has to be done in an organic way with multiple stakeholders. This is not a task for a donor only, but this is also a task that involves a deep understanding of each reality. And one thing that we usually tend to fail to understand is that because it's so much easier in terms of policy, of course, and in terms of budget to say, oh, the Sahel region or the MENA region, as if all the countries in the Sahel were homogeneous or suffered from the same problems, which they do not. And this applies to the other regions across the world that we tend to simplify for policy purposes, because it is much more practical to do so. And then I would say that in some cases, it doesn't matter if it's true or not. It matters if that reasons with the suffering or with the grievances or with the emptiness that a particular group or a particular country has been suffering of across the years. So this is why it is so difficult to tackle FIMI. This is why we always have the impression that it goes miles and miles and miles in front of us, and we are running and tired to come up with solutions when we basically come up with a solution, it's already outdated. But for example, I would like to call your attention for the fact that, for example, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are now receiving telecoms and surveillance satellites from Russia. The initial purpose is to surveil alterations on climate change and floods and to tackle the jihadist threat. But, and these are legitimate concerns, but hand in hand with this comes digital autocracy, which we have not mentioned here today, and it's a huge problem. There is digital autocracy today. There are also cyber mercenaries that we don't have time to talk about today. And in the end, this is only problematic because this undermines and rips off like the social fabric of each of these countries, but in the end, of ours as well. This has had a huge impact. Everything that has been happening, for example, in the Sahel, has had an indirect impact in European societies. It has also added and fueled identity crises in Europe and ways towards the solution. And this is something that we need more. And here I do agree with Gabriella, if I've don't, if I'm correct, on the need to study more and to understand more how the psychological dimension and emotional dimension play a role in geopolitics. That's it.
We've got time for just a couple more questions. One over here.
Hi, my name's Robin. I used to be a media literacy educator who was working on those kind of like ground up approaches that you guys have mentioned. We got a lot of central government people in the room, got a lot of bureaucrats, and there's been this like undercurrent in your three comments that we're maybe not designing the right kinds of implementations, we're not maybe putting the money in the right places. First side of the question is, where are we putting money currently where we shouldn't be? And secondly, how can we better empower these kind of bottom-up approaches? You know, what other innovative finance can we look at, whether it's kind of VC approaches or whatever else? I'm curious for how you would see that, how you would see that originating.
Okay, fantastic. And any other? I will take the two questions at the back, and then we're going to have to counter around that.
Hello, thank you. Yasmin Alta here, formerly Cabinet Office and OSF. I'm going to be the annoying person at these conferences who says, I'm going to go out on a limb and assume I'm one of the few people who has spent a lot of time in the Global South and is from the Global South in this room. It's not my first time attending this event, and there's always one of us who makes this point. I would be interested in how we might think about the Global South with more agency. It's wonderful to sit here and assume that we are the good guys, that we know the truth, and our version of the world is correct. But maybe it's a bit more ambiguous than that, and how we reckon with that. And further on that point, I also wonder to what extent, as a community working in this space, we encourage a holistic approach. So when I did work at Cabinet Office, there was very much the politicians set the tone. If it's veering into Russian narratives, especially on transphobia or other kinds of misinformation, as bureaucrats, it's none of our business. But I feel like more and more we need to really sit down with people who are setting a tone and say, you're kind of doing their work. And so I just wonder whether or not that's something we're open to.
Yeah, good, well made. Thank you.
Thanks. Dr. Tom Maguire, Leiden University. Very quickly, you've been outlining a few potential alternative approaches, the empowerment dynamic you've been talking about, and I appreciate you're not advocating fighting fire with fire, you've made that very clear. But in pursuing some of these potential approaches that you've outlined, how do you mitigate being accused of fighting fire with fire in terms of coming across as interfering, opening yourself up to being accused of doing the very thing that we accuse Russia of doing? I'm not suggesting a moral equivalence there at all. And then the second point, I guess, picks up the last 2 points as well, which is how do you do this in a way which isn't going to create significant diplomatic and political risk with some of the governments in the countries that you're talking about who may not be particularly supportive of some of these initiatives that you're outlining? Thank you.
Thank you. In one sentence, Justin, can you pick up more agency for the Global South in this conversation?
So firstly, the Global South as a term is not really, I mean, that already gets people's hackles up. Okay. It's the majority world. Yep. And I think that rather than speaking to and understanding that's where the anger is coming from, yeah, and accepting that there is kind of there is culpability by those in Europe and North America is an important first step to start an honest conversation.
Fantastic, thank you. Tom, where is money better spent?
Ooh, yeah.
In a sentence.
I think the question was, where should we not be spending it? Which is much more fun. Yes, so just to agree on the Global South point, because I'm originally from Australia. That's called Southern Country in translation, and that's the Global South. So we're not talking about that. That would be nonsense. Good. Where's the money shouldn't be spent? Okay, try not to ruffle too many feathers or hackles up. Can we take media literacy, critical thinking, and debunking out of the mainstay of counter-FIMI stuff? Because for the most part, a lot of money goes to it, and there's not really a great deal of proof that it works on scale or at scale. It can be good in of itself and for other purposes, but it does suck quite a lot of money out of the FIMI world, and that is because it's a tool that people know about, but they don't necessarily know how to deploy it, as I say, at scale.
Joanna, in a sentence, mitigate looking like you're fighting fire with fire. How do you mitigate against looking like you're fighting wildfire?
Well, again, going back to the very common sense, if it's an African problem, African solutions, and the question that Justin mentioned of historical memory and reparation have to be put in place. So there will be a moment where the point of reparation, which has actually been mentioned at the G20 this year, has to be, I think, the starting point for a new conversation. And just to also to add to your question, I would say starting by eliminating labeling like Global South, because it's so big that it looks like a backyard, but in fact it is not. So look at the uniqueness of each country, look at the problems of each country, and not try to apply a solution and one size fits all when the problems are so different.
Fantastic, thank you.
There was one additional question about which government agencies. And I think that governments like platforms are not kind of one thing. They're composed of many small little units. And I think there are centers of excellence. The EEAS, European External Action Service, is doing some really brave work around this stuff that goes beyond counter-messaging. And in the US, things like the GEC, some of the programming, not all of it, some of it. So I think we should also be more nuanced in terms of looking at government responses and figuring out which of those are actor-agnostic, kind of technocratic responses, rather than just kind of this knee-jerk narrative against narrative response.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for a fascinating discussion.